Welcome to Accessible, where we open the door to the people and ideas shaping the disability community. I'm George Gatto.
And I'm Amelia Reigard.
On Accessible, we talk with leaders, advocates, researchers, and individuals with lived experience to explore the issues shaping the disability field.
Accessible is produced in partnership with the Missouri Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, or LEND, and the Missouri University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or UCED for short.
And whether you work in the field, are connected personally to disability, or simply want to better understand how systems can support people with disabilities, Accessible opens the door to conversations that matter. Well, that was a fascinating conversation that we had with Robyn Linscott from the ARC. And I don't know, we have producer Catherine with us today. So listening in the background, Catherine, I feel a little bit overwhelmed about how much we talked about.
Definitely. There's a lot of background that I didn't really know. And there's so many levels of things that are happening. And I feel like it's important that we did this episode in a way, because I think that overwhelm is happening everywhere for a lot of people. And having these explainer episodes about some of these headline topics, like the changes at the Department of Ed, are really valuable. And it kind of gives us things to look out for.
Yeah. It is so easy to just get real busy with our day-to-day here and not even think about what's happening at the federal level and how it's going to impact our schools.
Well, because I feel like a lot of things are so reactive. You're just in your day-to-day. You're just reacting to the issues of the day. And I think it's really awesome that we have people like Robyn in those policy positions to be kind of zooming out and thinking about that bigger picture of how these things are affecting classrooms. I mean, she was also a special education teacher, so I think she understands kind of what that side is like also.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have any big takeaways, Amelia?
Yeah, I was going to say, I really like how she broke down some of what's happening federally, and how she grounded us first. Like she says, she grounds all the families she works with understanding that some of those federal protections and rights for students with disabilities aren't going away, but just how those things are being enforced. And so we spent a lot of time talking about IDEA, which, George, you want to talk a little bit about what IDEA is for any of our listeners who haven't or are unfamiliar with IDEA?
I mean, I'll do my best off the cuff. But yeah, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was a civil rights law that guarantees that students with disabilities have access to, I think the exact language is, free and appropriate public education. And so, for those of us in the disability world, or even people kind of on the periphery, you've heard of the Individualized Education Plan, the IEP. IEPs exist because of, and we're required to do IEPs because of the IDEA. But I even learned things that I either didn't know or had forgotten about the IDEA that Robyn reminded me of. So, like the whole thing of the federal government committing to cover 40% of the costs for a given state, and it's never ever gone beyond 18%. Did I say that correctly? But it just
I think so. Just that the IDEA is this, we set it as the standard. Like we're going to write this into law. This is what we want to achieve. And the fact that we have not achieved that ever to the letter of that law is it kind of just breaks open why we feel like the system isn't working. Because you're like, well, you're not meeting the floor, basically.
Right. And I think it also brings to light then why, families and individuals can feel so um, exhausted by the systems that aren't working.
Yes.
And thinking, well, we should blow up what exists and start over, which may need to happen in some instances, right? But to kind of look at IDA as, it's aspirational and what it set out to do. And I think Robyn refers to this in her interview, and she said it was nerdy to call the bill beautiful, but I don't think it was nerdy at all, honestly. That it's really a great piece of legislation, and it's truly aspirational in terms of protecting rights of students with disabilities, but that we just haven't. She talks about this, so maybe we should just get to Robyn, but implementation issues, right? So. It was a really great conversation. It's probably one of our longer episodes recently because we just couldn't stop asking Robyn questions. But
Well, I mean,
Yeah, buckle up.
do a part two.
I would
Buckle up.
just as a parent having sat in an IEP meeting, it can be really frustrating. And it's like, where is this frustration coming from? Is it the administrator? And she mentioned what a hard job it is to be a principal or superintendent, the administrator, the teacher, the parents, because we're all kind of trying to figure out how to use limited resources. And just that piece makes me realize, wow, we were all just trying to work within a system that is underfunded. And if it just had been fully funded, maybe it wouldn't have been frustrating. And my kids my son didn't even have serious, have a lot of needs in school, and it was completely frustrating for us. But anyway, I loved this conversation. I learned so much, so I hope everyone else enjoys it. All right, well, Robyn, we are so excited to have you here and get sort of a national perspective on special education and what's going on nationally. But maybe before we start, we would just love to learn a little bit about you and how you sort of arrived where you are.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Robyn Linscott, and I am currently the Director of Education and Family Policy at the ARC of the United States, our national office. We joke that kind of this is the family business. My mom was a special education teacher. My stepmom was OT for students with disabilities in a school. But it really starts with my brother, Neil. My brother, Neil, is autistic and has multiple disabilities, and he was actually served by a chapter of the ARC in New Jersey growing up. He attended after-school programs and summer programs when at the time those were really the ARC programs were the only ones accepting him because of his disability. So that really, I think, spurred so much of my desire to want to go into special education. I think I thought I was going to be in the classroom for my whole career. I was a special education teacher for 8 years in New York City. I taught high school social studies to students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. And I loved it, and I loved my students. But I really, really began to see more clearly a lot of the policy failures that were happening, especially with my particular population of students who were kind of what we would call multi-system connected youth. So the majority of them were at our school through the child welfare system, the juvenile legal system, all kind of having disabilities on top of that. And that really kind of just spurred my desire more to get into policy. It had always been kind of something that I had enjoyed and was really interested in, and took, politics classes in undergrad, but kind of made me take the leap. I left the classroom, and I actually had the opportunity to work on Capitol Hill for a couple years as an education policy fellow, and then being hired on in my office and getting to work on education and kind of some other disability policy issues. And that was it for me. The bug bit me, and I have been in policy ever since. After the 2020 election, I really had enjoyed working on the Hill, but I think really wanted to be on the advocacy side, where I could make sure that, the policies that I was advocating for were kind of solely based in what was best for students and their families, with a little bit less politics involved, though, there always is. And so I was so lucky to land this position at the ARC, and felt a little bit like it was kind of a full circle coming home moment, considering I think the ARC has played such an important role in my family and kind of our story. So
That's really, really interesting. I have a couple of questions about the policy work when you're in DC. How did that? If you could go back, like how does it reshape or change the way you think about your classroom work or what's happening in classrooms currently? What are the connections between policy and actual teaching in a classroom?
yeah, it's so interesting because I think there are so many times that I think, oh, I wish I could go back to the classroom and kind of redo this or rethink how I, think about this particular topic. But I think one thing that I've realized so much is that so many people who work in the policy space and in the education world, both who are creating laws, right, that are working on Capitol Hill, working in the administration, have never set foot in a classroom. And that's a really interesting, that's hard sometimes. And by no means, I think we need people who are experts in, legal things, and the people who are really like the super policy wonks. I like to say, I'm policy wonk adjacent. I do not consider myself one of the, the wonkiest of those, but I think it is interesting to see how much I think more people who have spent time in the classroom and with students and their families, how that could potentially make a really big difference in policy, because I think it leads to a little bit of this disconnect and this feeling that teachers have of, oh, the policymakers have no idea what we go through, and vice versa, right? Policymakers kind of making these kind of assumptions about teachers or parents or students. I think we need more people that can kind of help bridge that gap.
Yeah, I love that, bringing in the experience, either the lived experience, the classroom experience, into what's going on in the policy realm. Robyn, will you talk a little bit about the ARC of the United States? So you talked about your brother receiving services at the ARC of New Jersey. So like the state chapters, are they more direct service? And is the ARC of the United States more policy driven? Or what are kind of the arms of the ARC?
Yeah, so the ARC is the nation's largest community-based organization serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We are actually, in 2025, celebrated our 75th anniversary, so we have been around for a long time. And the ARC actually has just about 600 chapters across the country. And every chapter kind of has a little bit of its own identity and focus. My brother Neil was actually served by, I say the ARC of New Jersey because folks might not know the ARC of Hunterdon County. So he was actually served by a local chapter. So it really is our local chapters that are our service providers. So we have chapters that are providing education supports, right? They might have an education advocacy arm where they are assisting families through the IEP process, that are providing after-school and summer programs. We have a few chapters that run, childcare centers. We also have chapters that are run inclusive housing programs, that are providing home and community-based waiver services. So every local chapter a little bit different. Our state chapters really then focus on state policy and are really monitoring things at the state level, recognizing that so many policy things are really happening at the state level. So many things in education, so many things in Medicaid happening at the state level. And so us at the national chapter, our job, especially on our policy team where I live, we are really kind of the liaisons to the federal government, making sure that Congress and the administration are hearing their perspectives of individuals with IDD and their families, making sure that policy is being made with them in mind, being there to help shape good policy for folks with IDD, and potentially kind of bat down bad policy coming out for folks with IDD. So really federally focused in our national office.
So does that mean you spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking with legislators about disability issues?
Absolutely. That is a huge, huge portion of my job, talking with members of Congress and their staff, talking with officials in the administration, as well as kind of, I think, translating those things that are happening on Capitol Hill to our wider audience, our state chapters, our local chapters, and to our families. It's kind of a complex insider world. So a lot of my job is kind of breaking down what this means, at all different levels.
Yeah. I've spent most of my career in the West or the Midwest working at USEDS, doing just the research and the work, not thinking a whole lot about policy and what's going on in DC. But then last summer, after we had some executive orders that sort of threatened the funding for USEDS, all of a sudden I found myself going to DC, going to the Senate, the Dirksen building, and going a couple others to talk with Missouri legislators, and we also visited Kansas. But anyway, I guess that it just blew me away how accessible people were. Our senators and Congress people were. I don't know. I just was a little surprised by that. And I just think it's really kind of a thing that we should all do more if we can get to DC, is go and speak to our legislators.
Yeah, I think it's something I didn't even know until I started working in the Senate, was that you can just walk into any of the buildings, into the Senate, and into any of the Senate office buildings, any of the House buildings. You have to go through security, but other than that, the buildings are open. You can even walk into any member's office and leave materials if you wanted. You could say, hey, I have this handout about what the USEDS do. I have this handout about what this program that I'm running for, fill in the blank in my state and your district. And you can just do that. And I think there is this perception that it is this kind of, closed off. No one can go in there, but it's easier to walk into any of those buildings than it is to walk into the airport. So
100%. It shocked me. I just did not, I guess, I don't know. It shows my ignorance. But I did not realize how easy it was just to walk in, stop by, leave information. And, we didn't get to talk to everyone that we were hoping to talk to, but we did get to leave information and talk to their staffers. So,
well, I love this description, Robyn, of being the liaison between, legislators and the federal government and your local chapters, but also the individuals that are impacted by the ARC chapters that the individuals that the ARC chapters serve. And I think it is such an important role because, in the last year, there have been so many headlines, right? So many petitions and news articles, right? So much information coming at us about changes that are happening at that federal level. And in particular, we're going to talk about changes within the U.S. Department of Education and how that impacts students with disabilities. So I think that liaison hat is sort of the hat that I'm excited to hear from you from today, is sort of what are the most, in your opinion, the significant shifts or changes happening in the federal government that we should be paying attention to, right? Because there's just been an onslaught of information. So what are you paying attention to? What are some of those big things we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a big question. And, there's kind of a couple of different buckets. But I think to start this question off, I think the ARC has tried to do a really balanced job this last year or so in raising awareness of what potentially could happen and the impact that these big changes could have, while also making sure that especially families and students know that the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right, will remain law unless a massive act of Congress happens, which, if you look at kind of our track record of getting things done, maybe not likely to happen. That law is still in place. Students' IEPs are still in place, right? These basic core tenets, the day-to-day, we're just really trying to make sure that this massive feeling of dread and alarm does not wash over families who are dealing with so much already in this process. That I think we've really tried to balance that this is where we need to make sure we are putting in some advocacy, but also it is going to be okay. We are going to try and, we are going to work our hardest to make sure that, these issues are raised. But so I always like to preface what we're saying, because kind of some of the things we're talking about, can sound really big and scary, and they are, but we also want people to make sure that, it's going to be okay. So when we're kind of thinking about these big buckets of changes, I think it's also important to remember the role that the federal government has in education, especially in special education, right? So for the most part, the federal government actually doesn't have a huge role in general education, right? Those decisions most of those decisions are left to the states and the local school districts. Federal government is not deciding on curriculum, is not deciding on teacher standards, is, not deciding on a lot of these things that are, what we kind of think about in our day-to-day education space. What they are there to do is provide funding, to provide enforcement of the laws that exist, and to provide oversight and to kind of provide a last piece of recourse for families who have not been able to get resolution of issues in other ways. So if we kind of first talk about funding, when Congress first passed IDEA in 1975, they promised to fund up to 40% of the excess cost of educating students with disabilities. They recognized that educating these students was more expensive, but the right thing to do, and they said, we're going to kick in this amount of money. Well, we've never come close to that. In fact, each year we kind of teeter, but right anywhere from like 11 to 14-ish%. We hit a high watermark kind of right during the Great Recession, like 18%.
Wow. Not even half.
Not even half. Yeah. And we know that as more and more students are being identified, and often identified earlier, which is great, right? We want students to be identified as early as possible and get access to those services. That's a growing fiscal pressure on school districts. And the federal government is not keeping up. And so school districts are left to make really difficult decisions. So that's kind of, a piece that, a significant piece that the federal government does. Luckily, we actually haven't seen a catastrophic change in funding levels. We have seen some individual grant programs that have been canceled and things like that. But I think at the start of last year, we had some greater concerns about funding, and some of those actually haven't come to fruition. And part of that is because the advocacy of folks and across states saying, this is why the federal role here is so important. So that's funding. Second piece is enforcement, right? So the federal government has a really big role in enforcing and providing oversight of IDEA, right? Each year, they are assessing every single state to see how they are abiding by all of the tenets of IDEA for Part B, which is school-age children, and then Part C, which is early intervention, birth through 2. Every year, every state basically gets like the equivalent of a report card, of meets expectations or not meeting expectations. And there are different levers that get kind of pulled when states hit different benchmarks for multiple years in a row. If a school needs support for multiple years in a row, there's kind of different programs and some funding that gets unlocked.
Is that accessible to anybody to see?
Absolutely, yes. So each year they publish, usually in the summer, like July-ish, they publish, the Department of Education on their website publishes, they're called determinations for every single state. And so you can kind of see really quickly the buckets, like where the multiple buckets where each state stacks up. And then you can actually find the individual state letters. This is a letter from the Department of Education to the state that says, hey, here are the reasons that you actually fell into this bucket of needs intervention or needs assistance. And so these are where you need to kind of focus some more resources if you want to move up a grade next year, basically.
One of the things that we had been throwing around before we started talking with you was just, given that IDEA does say, least restrictive environment possible. One of the things that we have in Missouri, and I don't know how extensive it is around the country, but we have special school districts for, essentially segregated schools for people with IDD. And I guess I'm wondering, how prevalent are those, and what is the current thinking on those sorts of schools nationally?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think this looks very different from state to state. For example, some states like Missouri or, in New York City, the actual city itself has some specified public schools for students with the most significant disabilities. In many states, what it is that you have an approved private school that is actually serving a student with a disability if the school district was unable to meet that student's needs. But that is actually fully paid for by the school district themselves. It is not the parents placing the child in a private school. So it looks very different, kind of the machinations from state to state, but I think the underlying thinking is similar, right? I think at the ARC, we advocate and we recognize that inclusive settings benefit all students with disabilities and non-disabled students. And we also recognize that not every setting is able to provide the supports that all students need. And for many families, they have tried and tried to, they might want their child to remain in their neighborhood school, and they have tried every avenue to get that child the support that they need, and they have come up against roadblocks, and they feel like their only option is to put the child into a segregated school. And for some families, that is, a great decision, and they feel happy. And some families wish that they didn't have to make that decision, right? That they were able to access an inclusive environment, but those resources just weren't there. So, I think this is such an individual, family, really difficult decision for families to make. And we recognize that great education for students with disabilities can happen, across the board. We would love that families could have every single resource and opportunity to keep their child in an inclusive environment. And that is, I think, what we're not seeing, right?
Now, if we could get to that 40% of funding from the federal government, do you think that would help with more, people be able to receive the services they need in their neighborhood schools? Or?
I think it would, because services are expensive, right? And remember, services, anything that is written into an IEP under IDEA is mandated by law. So a school district technically doesn't have the option to say, oh, an occupational therapist is too expensive, so we're just not going to have one. A student is mandated to have those services. But I think there are a lot of things that additional funding, would alleviate so much of a burden on the school district, because they would just have more money to be able to work with. We could have smaller classrooms. We could have more paraprofessionals that have, that get continuing and ongoing training and education. We might be able to have more opportunities for students to have a one-to-one paraprofessional. I think so often that is a threshold for when a school says that they might not be able to support a student anymore, and to look at an alternative placement is when a student demonstrates that they might need a one-to-one paraprofessional. And so if schools had more money, we might not see that being such a threshold for schools to kind of begin that conversation of an alternative placement.
Well, I was just thinking about where that tension sort of, I don't know if it's the right term, but sort of bottlenecks then, because there's legally through IDEA, these services, like you're saying, they're meant to be provided, right? If it's written into the IEP, the student has the right and the family has a right to those services. And yet there's underfunding, right? There's understaffing. And so I know from just some family or friends who are in education and some in special education that a lot of it falls on special education teachers. And I don't know if, Robyn, in your experiences, like they're trying to both be educators and fulfill all these legal requirements and do all this documentation and paperwork. And where do you see right now the pressure is sort of falling, and how is that impacting the system, I guess?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think you're right. So much of the pressure, is falling on educators, on special education teachers, on related service providers. They are kind of constantly asking to do more with less. To take on a bigger caseload, right? Which does require not only, additional students that you're teaching, but that is additional data that you have to collect and report on to, how students are meeting their goals in their IEP. That is additional parent communication. That is additional IEP meetings. That, it is not just like one additional student in a class. I think we also see districts trying to, work within their budget and say, kind of, what is the legal floor here, and how can we meet that bare minimum legal requirement, when they kind of might know that we know it would be better for this student to get X, but the legal minimum is Y. And we currently only have the resources to meet the legal minimum. I think about something like, speech and language therapy. The minimum is that the student gets speech and language therapy for 30 minutes twice a week. But, we know it might be better if they had that for 45 minutes twice a week, right? Which is a district going to choose when they have limited resources? They can probably get one more slot out of a speech and language therapist if they cut it down to 30 minutes, even though we know maybe 45 minutes might actually be better for the student, right? Just really kind of coming down to those small incremental things.
Yeah. I think earlier your explanation of, kind of the buckets of what's happening and the foundation of IDEA, and like this isn't going away, right? These legal protections, the expectation, which in some ways is aspirational, right? Because the federal government isn't even meeting their minimum bar of what they said that they were able to commit. That still exists, and there's some, because of changes in this is me regurgitating, Robyn, what you said. I'm like, let me see if I understand it. Because of these changes in the federal government and potentially, a minimized or eliminated Department of Education, it's really going to change how enforcement or compliance of IDEA looks. Does that kind of where the concern is, right?
Absolutely. It's like, I think we were talking about these buckets of like what the federal government actually does in education and special education. And now if we bring it around to, so what does that mean about all these headlines that we have been hearing and reading, that you've really hit the nail on the head in that the enforcement and the oversight is where we are most concerned that these changes are, going to affect. So we have seen massive reductions in force or layoffs at the Department of Education. In October, nearly every single person who works at the Office of Special Education Programs was laid off. Nearly every single person. Now, all of those people have been brought back. But something like that, it's almost like the chaos itself creates these tiny little cracks, and those little cracks never go away. I've spoken with some school district leaders and some state level special education leaders who say that we're so happy that all these folks are back at the office of, and it's called OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs. But we're so concerned that it's going to happen again. And we're really concerned, everything just seems so unstable and chaotic right now that we're a little bit afraid as we begin to plan for next school year's budget and funding. Heard from a school leader that was like, I was going to try and hire one more full-time occupational therapist, and now I'm concerned that what if funding isn't there? I know funding hasn't really been affected right now, but we never know what might happen, and so I'm afraid to commit myself for another year. And so even when these big changes and these big decisions have been made or reversed, it's never, the effects linger.
Yeah. We had a really interesting conversation with Amy Hewitt, who's director of the Minnesota Youth Ed, a year ago, around December 2024. Okay, so kind of before a lot of things started happening, right? But there was a lot of like what will happen as administrations change over. We know priorities change, like what could come. And she posed this really interesting question that I think I keep coming back to, which is, even your own explanation of the funding levels for IDEA never even being half of what the federal government originally intended to support that legislation, that some of these systems haven't always worked the best, right? Like some of what was in place wasn't maybe serving students with disabilities and their families the best, right? So if it's going to change anyways, like what could we imagine that would be better, right? Like, because sometimes we spend, I think in USEDS and some of the applied research we do, we are looking to support systems that already exist, that are already entrenched in whatever their historical context was, right? And we're kind of fixing things as we're providing services, as we're going along our business. But if things were to drastically change, it's sort of like, what kind of a world could we imagine where students are getting all their needs met, where they are in least restrictive environment, where they are in inclusive schools? Does some of this change inspire some of that thinking, that radical thinking of like, what if we could imagine a system that actually works better?
Yeah, absolutely, right? And I think we as advocates are having this conversation all the time, right? I think about all the conversations like post-COVID about like, how could this reimagine our education system? And, I think we in DC recognize that this is going to sound so nerdy, but like IDEA is such a beautiful law, and where it breaks down is in the implementation. And we know that. We recognize that families are beating their heads against a table every day trying to get services for their, for their children, for their students with disabilities. We know educators are burnt out. We know administrators are trying to do more with less. We know that there are pieces of the system that aren't working for anybody. And I think in that same conversation, we also recognize that there's still, even as we could potentially reimagine what this looks like, there is at least a minimum level that the federal government needs to remain and participate in when it comes to the education of students with disabilities. This administration has said they want to send all of education back to the states, including special education and education for students with disabilities. And our concern is when we think back to before IDEA, when more than half of students with disabilities were not educated at all, were not allowed to be in school, and that varied by state. Some states said, yes, we will educate students with disabilities, and other states said no. In Pennsylvania, it took a group of families from the Arc of Pennsylvania to sue the state of Pennsylvania to allow their children with intellectual disabilities to walk into the school. So we feel very concerned when we talk about these things about sending education back to the states, that we are going to end up with a patchwork system of education for students with disabilities in this country. Now, we know, everyone knows that there are districts that are really great for serving students with disabilities and others that are known for being not as great. But there right now is a federal floor, and there are structures in place that are supposed to support schools and teachers and families when things are not going the way that they are supposed to. And if we get rid of that, what do we have left? So I think as we potentially envision a new system in our, I think in the greater disability, many of the disability advocates' minds, there is still a really, really important role for the federal government to play. And this is what we are trying to preserve.
Yeah. One of the things that we've heard is that maybe special education would be moved out of the Department of Education and administered through block grants out of Health and Human Services. I mean, is that even allowable under the IDEA?
Great question. Question on a lot of people's minds in DC these days, and I think around the country. So under IDEA, it says that an Office of Special Education Programs will administer IDEA, and that is to live in a Department of Education. Congress would need to act to ensure that was followed, and I think we haven't necessarily seen Congress have a lot of appetite to do a lot of those oversight things right now. So I think we can imagine these things happening kind of despite what IDEA says, or that kind of logistically there are workarounds or loopholes where technically this department still lives here, but really in function, it moves somewhere else. So there have been a lot of discussions about the office. So OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, lives within a slightly bigger office called OSERS, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. So that includes all the VOC rehab programs that students with disabilities and then adults with disabilities are able to access. So that's one office. There's been talk about moving that to the Department of Health and Human Services. Also, there has been talk about moving it to the Department of Labor. So earlier this year, or actually not this year, last year, at the end of 2025, there were 6 different programs and offices that were moved out of the Department of Education into other agencies through what are called interagency agreements. One of those offices was the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which oversees the majority of kind of K-12 general ed. That now lives at the Department of Labor. We as disability advocates have significant concerns about the office being moved out of the Department of Education, and even more concerns about it being moved to HHS. I think we feel like this harkens us back to this really medicalized model of disability, right? Where disability was a disease to be cured, even for students, as opposed to kind of special education being a set of supports and services that students can receive. Brings us back to kind of like the time before IDEA, where the only way that you could get education as a student with a disability is in a hospital or an institutional setting. Also, what is it saying about what we think about students with disabilities, where we think it is okay to segregate the programs that serve students with disabilities from the programs that serve general education students? Because they all overlap, right? There are pieces of the general education law that serve students with disabilities. All of these education laws have been written to all align with each other. And so like, once you start pulling on a single thread, it all kind of begins to unravel. The secretary has said to us, there will be no programs that remain at the Department of Education. What we might have are a single person, maybe two people for each program who are at the department to kind of get around this legal piece of the department living there, when everyone else is at the other agency. We are working really hard to make sure that our opinions are known. About a month ago in January, it was really interesting. The Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services hosted a 3-hour-long public listening session about kind of special education in general and the Department of Education. And over the course of 3 hours, there wasn't a single person who advocated or who said they wanted to see the office moved out of the Department of Ed, or that they wanted to see the federal role reduced. They talked about struggles. They said this is what's really difficult. They said this is not a perfect system by any means, but this is not the way to fix those problems.
How do you think that message was received by those at the hearing? Like, was it received?
I think Acting Assistant Secretary Kim Rishi, who is the Assistant Secretary for OSERS, said at the end of the session, message heard. We heard that HHS is not where you want this to live. So it has made us wonder, does this mean it is more likely that the office gets moved to the Department of Labor to keep it integrated or to keep it connected with the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education? We don't necessarily, the expertise lives at the Department of Education. All of these programs should remain at the Department of Education together, but I think we are a little more concerned about it being moved to HHS.
Yeah. There's so much to consider right now. And I think one thing that you've got me thinking about, Robyn, is just even in your explanation of like the arc and how much happens locally, right? Things about curriculum, right? Teacher standards, all of those things are happening at a state or local level. And also I'm thinking about how you talked about, families, parents, people who are already doing the advocacy for students with disabilities are sort of beating their head against the wall to kind of get adequate or, meet that floor threshold of services. How can the community and those of us who maybe aren't directly related to those roles link arms with families, with individuals, right? How can we link arms and support, right? Or advocate or come alongside to make sure these voices continue to be amplified at the local level?
Yeah. Again, another really great question. I think when I've been talking with a lot of especially my state chapters, we have been talking with them about or they've been coming to us with this question of how can we put protections in place at the state level if those protections might be going away or lessening at the federal level. And those questions have involved a lot around specifically the Office for Civil Rights. So the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Ed investigates claims of discrimination against disability, against gender, against race, religion. And we have seen that office gutted in their personnel. They have, I think, about a third of the folks. It might even be less than that. And I can come back with exact numbers. I didn't prep them. Of the folks the attorneys there that investigate cases, there is a significant backlog of cases that have yet to be heard. And we've also heard from families that many cases are being marked as resolved without any type of investigation happening. And so some states have said to us, can we create a state level OCR, Office for Civil Rights, that, if the due process has not, been effective for families, or if families think that their school district is discriminating against their child because of a disability or against many children with disabilities, can they bring this to us at the state level as opposed to going to the federal level? And some states have some kind of program like that. There are some states that have like a special education ombudsman. And so we have some states that are looking to kind of create something like that so that there is one more additional level in case we see the federal Office for Civil Rights kind of continue to unravel. I think at the local level, at the school district level, just making sure that administrators know and school districts know the impact that certain budget cuts, what that actually means on the ground and for students. I think of all the jobs in education that I want or don't want, I think a principal or superintendent is right at the top of, I can't imagine the pressure, right? They are forced to make impossible decisions about programs and budgets. And, I think making sure that they know what certain programs or what children being able to access certain resources means for those students, really personalizing it and sharing it as a story, I think can help bring some of those like numbers in a spreadsheet to life. It's hard, we've been telling families run for school board. In a 501c3 compliant way, of course. But making sure that there are families and individuals with disabilities represented and involved at every level of, everywhere that's making decisions, right? Whether it's the PTA or the local school board, city council, making sure that voice is heard.
Yeah. Well, gosh. That is a lot that you've shared with us.
And I feel like there's 100 things that we didn't even hit on.
Absolutely. We might have to do a follow-up interview if that's all right. Yeah. But for today, if anyone wants to learn more about you or more about your work, where can they go?
Well, everyone can go to thearc.org to learn more about the ARC. I would also make a pitch for when you go to thearc.org, we have action alerts. We have a advocacy center, so people can actually really quickly put in their address, their email address, and they can contact their members of Congress directly through our action alert. So I always like to make that plug. We have amazing resources on the ARC's website about a variety of topics. And if people have, specific questions or things that they want to know, I want people to feel free to email me at linscott@thearc.org.
This has been so informative, Robyn. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I agree we could probably have a part 2. There's so much going on, but it's just really helpful. And I think you've grounded us in a lot of great information, especially around like rights that will remain intact, but it's like, how do we then come and respond to some of the changes to make sure that they're protected? Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a treat.
Yeah, thank you, Robyn.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Accessible. Accessible is hosted and produced by George Gatto, Amelia Reigard, and Catherine Toller from the University of Missouri, Kansas City Institute for Human Development, which is the home of the Missouri USED. Accessible is a joint project between the Missouri USED and the Missouri LEND program, which is funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services through grant number T73MC00022. Episodes of Accessible are released every 2 weeks and can be found wherever you subscribe to your podcast. Join us next time to hear more insights and ideas from leaders in the disability world.